Robert Eggers' 2024 hit movie brought Nosferatu back with a vengeance, but this was not the first remake of the 1922 classic. No, that would be the 1979 version by famed German director Werner Herzog, starring Klaus Kinski and Isabelle Adjani. But while the Eggers version was the original movie redone, the Herzog movie changed things up in a number of ways. For one thing, it retained the names from the original Bram Stoker novel, so there's no Thomas Hutter or Count Orlok here, it's Jonathan Harker and Count Dracula. Why did Herzog do that, and why would an auteur filmmaker like him do a remake of Nosferatu in the first place? And which other vampire movie was so influential it inspired both Herzog and Eggers? We're about to find out, so take a deep breath and strap in, because we're going for a deep dive. First things first, this video assumes that you already have some level of familiarity with the original Nosferatu, so to make sure that you are up to speed, begin by watching our ultimate retrospective on that, which you'll find linked to in the description, as this video at the very least partially builds on that. And if you haven't actually seen the original movie, do not fret, we have you covered there as well, as you can find our version right here on this channel in 4K with a brand new score, brand new intertitles featuring our own translations of the original German, and perhaps most importantly, the most accurate color tints since the movie was first released in 1922, as contrary to popular belief, it was never intended to be seen in black and white. Now, let's move on with the next iteration of Nosferatu, namely Werner Herzog's Nosferatu, and in order to fully appreciate its significance, we have to begin way back in time. In the early 1920s, an argument can be made that German cinema, especially German Expressionism, was the finest cinema in the world, pushing the medium to ever new heights, with directors like F.W. Murnau and Fritz Lang leading the charge, with movies like Nosferatu and Metropolis. From the mid to late 20s, however, many of the greatest talents, both behind and in front of the camera, relocated to Hollywood and joined the rising American stars, thereby contributing towards pushing the American film industry to ever new heights. Back in Germany, meanwhile, as the 30s progressed, more and more of the movies made became propagandistic in nature, leading up to that strife in the 40s, during which most movies were all-out propaganda. In the aftermath of that strife, which Germany lost, the movies that were made under strict limitations on what kind of stories could be told and under Allied supervision, which was understandable given the situation, but hardly a conducive environment for pushing the medium of filmmaking forward, and that situation persisted for many, many years. Now, to be clear, elsewhere, the art of filmmaking was still pushed forward, with each new generation of filmmakers building on the achievements of the previous. But that was in the US, the UK, France, and the other European nations. The uniquely German branch of filmmaking had been cut short, and the new German films that were cut off from their own cultural origin and heritage. By the time the shackles were off and a new generation of German filmmakers could truly be innovative again, they in a sense had to start over and form a new German cinematic culture. One of the most exciting filmmakers to come out of this, and one of the most important names in the renaissance of German cinema, was Werner Herzog. Born September 5, 1942, Werner Herzog is a German filmmaker, author, and sometimes actor, like when he appeared as the client in the Disney Plus Star Wars series The Mandalorian. Mostly though, he is a pioneer of the new German cinema, and his films often places his cast and crew into very real and very challenging situations, mirroring those in the film they're working on. Like in Fitzcarraldo, where the character in the film had to move a big-ass boat over a hill in the middle of a jungle. Well, his cast and crew had to live that experience and actually pull that stunt off on a shoestring budget. Herzog has directed more than 60 movies and documentaries, and among his greatest work are the movies he made with Klaus Kinski, one of the greatest actors of all time, the last expressionistic actor, and a certifiable madman, as in a rage-driven, abusive screamer whom everyone hated to be around, up to and including his own children, and who at one point was clinically diagnosed as a full-on psychopath. Kinski still appeared in much more than 100 films though, but in most of those he only had 1 or 2 minutes of screen time, because that way he got a paycheck, the movie got to benefit from his name on the poster as he was universally recognized as an extraordinary talent, while the filmmakers didn't have to endure his insanity for more than a day or two, which was all most people who weren't Werner Herzog could take. And Herzog couldn't take it either, right up until the moment when he tamed him. That happened on the set of Aguirre, the first time they worked together. That was also a guerrilla movie filmed on a shoestring budget in the middle of the jungle, with Herzog's cast and his regular minimal crew all having to endure the same misery as the doomed characters in the film. As such, everyone was having a miserable time anyway, in order that the misery would come across on film. But Kinski's screaming fits and antics made everything unbearable, and at one point threatened to shut down production. That's when Herzog pulled out a gun and made it clear to Kinski that the discomfort of making this movie was temporary, while it would go on to live forever as a work of art. And if Kinski got in the way of that, Herzog would shoot him on the spot and aim at himself thereafter. Kinski respected Herzog after that, and while he kept up his screaming fits, he did so in a way that Herzog was able to manage. And more than that, even navigate to get the performance he wanted once the screaming stopped and cameras could roll. Herzog and Kinski would, in the end, make a total of 5 films together, representing the best work either of them ever did. The second of the 5 was Nosferatu, which we now, finally, can get to. If you're still here and you like deep dive content like this, then please smash the like on this video, leave a comment or 3, help share it, and of course, subscribe for many more deep dives like this. For now though, let's get into Nosferatu, beginning with the question, why remake such a classic at all, and why do it in the late 70s? Here comes the point of the earlier discussion on the history of German cinema. Herzog has described his generation of filmmakers as a fatherless one, as instead of learning from and building upon the films from the generation of their fathers, as filmmakers in other countries like the US and everywhere else simply took for granted. The German filmmakers of Herzog's generation instead had to look to their grandfathers, the German expressionists, for inspiration. In the continuum of German cinema, there was a gap of decades, a very clear before and after the war. The purpose and ultimate motivation behind Werner Herzog's Nosferatu remake was to bridge that gap. He considered the original Nosferatu to be the best German movie ever made, and as such, Herzog made his Nosferatu both as a tribute and as a way to build a new continuum between Murnau's generation and the German Expressionism, and Herzog's generation and the Renaissance of German film, a continuum not tainted by that strife in the 1940s. In essence then, the ultimate purpose of Werner Herzog's Nosferatu was to re-legitimize German cinema, both in Germany as well as in the world at large. In order to do that though, the movie needed to have a wider commercial appeal than any of his previous movies, so for his version of Nosferatu, Herzog made the decision to do something he never had done before and never would do again: follow the rules. The original Nosferatu is the oldest extant Dracula adaptation, though in the more than half a century between it and Herzog's Nosferatu, there had been numerous Dracula adaptations and even more generic vampire movies made in the mold of Dracula. And between them all, a clear set of rules for these movies had been clearly established, both in terms of how the narrative should be presented, as well as the abilities and weaknesses of the vampires themselves. Many of these rules had no root in actual folklore, mind you. They were inventions of the film industry, starting out as tropes that became so recurring that they soon were adopted as rules. Like how vampires will die in sunlight. In folklore, that is associated with trolls, not vampires. But after the idea was first introduced on film in the original Nosferatu, it recurred in so many other movies it soon became a rule the audience treated as a given. Other rules were added since, like that vampires will cast no reflection, have an aversion to garlic and the cross, and shouldn't be fed after midnight. No wait, strike that last one, wrong species. Anyway, point is that even if these rules for the most part were inventions of the film industry, the audience knew them, and what is more, came to expect them of their vampire movies.
It's the rules.
So prevalent were these rules that even if the original Nosferatu predated most of them, Werner Herzog felt that he had to abide by them in order for his Nosferatu to be accepted by contemporary audiences. Problem was, Herzog didn't know these rules. He didn't care much for Dracula movies, or maybe he would have if he had seen any, but he hadn't. He hadn't seen the Universal Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. He hadn't seen any of the Hammer Draculas starring Christopher Lee. Hell, he hadn't even seen the Jess Franco Dracula starring Christopher Lee sporting the book-accurate mustache, and even featuring Klaus Kinski himself as Renfield. Nor had he seen any of the other schlocky vampire movies of the day, and what is more, he wasn't going to. A man like Werner Herzog is meticulous about how he spends his time, and at the time, even getting copies of all of these movies to watch was no easy feat. Remember, this was the late 70s. There were no streaming options, no Blu-ray, no DVD, even VHS rentals were still in the future. So instead of researching the entire vampire subgenre to learn the rules of it, he honed in on the one movie which was made by a filmmaker he respected, and which already had done all the necessary research for him and distilled it all into what was then, and in my personal opinion remains to this day, the finest vampire movie ever made. Let's take a moment to explore that movie and how it influenced not just Werner Herzog's Nosferatu, but even Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. Originally premiered in the UK in late 1967, Roman Polanski's Dance of the Vampires was the perfect distillation of the entire vampire genre, presented in the visual style of the Hammer horror movies. The movie takes place in the mid-19th century and features Jack McGowan as the ailing Van Helsing-like Professor Abronsius, who travels with his one loyal companion and student, Alfred, played by writer and director Roman Polanski himself in his most personal role. They've traveled far and wide, looking to prove the existence of vampires and to eradicate the threat they represent to an enlightened, civilized world that no longer believes in them, and which even considers Professor Abronsius to be a superstitious nut for doing so. After a long quest in an inn in the Transylvanian countryside, they find the signs of vampirism they're looking for, though the locals deny anything is off, because they live in terror of the Dracula-like Count Orlok. I won't spoil any more of the movie here, other than to say that it is fantastic, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. However, MGM, the distributor, didn't quite get it at the time of release, because while it looks and presents as a Hammer horror movie and has some very serious and dark moments, it also has its funny moments. A good comparison is the original Ghostbusters, which while frequently mistaken for a comedy, is actually an earnest movie about entrepreneurship and the occult, with some funny moments. For those more familiar with Star Trek than this brand of cinema, I could also liken it to the Orville of Dracula and vampire movies. Alas, neither the Ghostbusters nor the Orville were out in 1967, and without that frame of reference, distributor MGM didn't get it. So, while the movie was released as Dance of the Vampires in Europe, where it was well received, for the American market, MGM decided to go in a different direction and sell it as a parody of the vampire genre. Thus, with the support from the head of theatrical post-production Merle Chamberlain, MGM's supervising editor Margaret Booth re-edited the movie to that end. For its 1968 US release then, the movie was cut by 10 minutes. Jack McGovern was overdubbed by some goofball to make Professor Abronsius more comedic. A rushed animated prologue was added, and finally, the title was changed from Dance of the Vampires to The Fearless Vampire Killers, or pardon me, but your teeth are in my neck. This version of the movie was disowned by Polanski and flopped upon release, and is the reason why most of you watching probably have never heard about it. However, the movie saw a resurgence when Polanski's original director's cut was screened in later re-releases, though still under the title The Fearless Vampire Killers. It went on to garner a cult following, and has even been the subject of a musical adaptation in Europe. Today, more than half a century after its initial release, the director's cut of The Fearless Vampire Killers is the only version that is available on any format, while many believe the studio's altered theatrical cut to be lost. It still exists though, and I have seen it myself from beginning to end. It is locked up in Turner Archives though, and is as such not available for public viewing. Not that you need it, of course, stick with the director's cut, which is actually available. That aside, adding to the movie's infamy, Roman Polanski's character falls in love with the innkeeper's daughter, played by Sharon Tate. Polanski didn't know her beforehand, but over the course of filming, the two fell in love for real, and they married shortly after the movie. Then, on August 9, 1969, when she was 8 months pregnant with Polanski's child, she was murdered by members of the Manson family cult, after which Polanski was a little bit out of it. All of his baggage that tarnish him to this day happened in the aftermath of that. All of that, however, would of course put this film on the radar of a filmmaker like Werner Herzog, making Roman Polanski's The Fearless Vampire Killers, the only other movie that inspired Herzog's version of Nosferatu other than the original 1922 classic. All of the conventional vampire rules in Herzog's Nosferatu not seen in the original, like the vampire's aversion to the cross and garlic, the expanded scene at the inn, that vampires don't cast a reflection, and most importantly, that a vampire can turn his victims into other vampires, all came from The Fearless Vampire Killers. And the movie didn't just inspire Herzog. By all outwardly appearances, it must have inspired Robert Eggers for his Nosferatu as well. In the original Nosferatu, Professor Bulwer, the movie version of Van Helsing, has a very small role, and in keeping with that, he has a similarly small role in Herzog's Nosferatu. In Eggers' Nosferatu, however, the corresponding character, played by Willem Dafoe, has a major role, but a vastly different characterization and even a different name than he had in the original movie, something which stands out from all the other characters, which in turn suggests a different inspiration. More specifically, since he is a disgraced professor obsessed with the occult who has but one loyal student, that inspiration would appear to be Professor Abronsius. That tidbit out of the way, let's get back to Herzog's Nosferatu and the sacrifice that had to be made as a result of the decision to abide by the vampiric rules the contemporary audience expected. What surprises newcomers the most about Robert Eggers' Nosferatu remake is that it is about demonic possession more so than it is a classical vampire story, at least from the perspective of the audience. That is, however, Eggers being true to the original, for as we established in our retrospective covering it, the original 1922 Nosferatu predated the later vampire tropes Hollywood would go on to invent, and was instead deeply steeped in the occult and demonology. Albin Grau, the producer and creative driving force behind the original movie, as well as his chosen writer, Henrik Galeen, were both practicing occultists and for all intents and purposes, Satanists. To them, vampires were no common subspecies of human, as later movies would have them out to be. No, to them, vampires were the undead, walking corpses, and demonic in nature and origin, as we see in the Eggers movie. In the original Nosferatu, Count Orlok sprang from the seed of the demon Belial, meaning he was never turned into a vampire by another vampire. Nor was he capable of turning anyone else into vampires, only Belial could do that. As such, Orlok was either the result of an unholy union between a human and a demon, or what happens when a human, maybe an Eastern European count with occult leanings, conjures and enters a Faustian bargain with a demon. That's the interpretation Robert Eggers went with in his version, which went all in on Nosferatu's demonic connection. But in Herzog's version, that aspect of the story was sacrificed in adherence to the rules of a vampire story of the kind the audience at the time expected. And at that time, it was arguably the right choice. If anything, the audience of 1979 would have been more confused if Herzog had gone with the occult angle of the original movie than were audiences in 2024, when Eggers did so for his version. Herzog then went with the expectations of the contemporary audience, and he went all in. There is a common misconception that the names were changed in the original Nosferatu in order to dodge copyright, but in reality, it was done to create names and locations that would be more familiar to the German audience that the movie was made for. Also, keep in mind that in 1922, the name Dracula, let alone the names of any of the other characters from Bram Stoker's novel, were completely unknown to the public at large, so there was no intrinsic value in keeping the original names anyway. Remember, Dracula didn't go mainstream until the 1931 movie starring Bela Lugosi. Even so, the original Nosferatu never attempted to hide the fact that the story was inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was even acknowledged in the movie's credits. The entire legal dispute was only ever about money. By 1979, however, that was no longer an issue, as Bram Stoker's Dracula had long since entered the public domain, meaning Werner Herzog now had the opportunity to use the original names without having to pay a dime for them. And by 1979, names like Dracula, Jonathan Harker, and Van Helsing were widely known among contemporary audiences, so using the original names was a no-brainer. Thus, for Herzog's Nosferatu, Orlok and Thomas Hutter were out, Dracula and Jonathan Harker were in. Also in was international and even US distribution, courtesy of Fox. Since the whole intention behind the movie was to re-legitimize German cinema, not just in Germany but in the eyes of the world, the movie had to be accessible, or at the very least, as accessible as a Werner Herzog movie can be, and to this end, it was decided early on that two parallel versions of the movie would be made, one German and one English, with key dialogue scenes being shot twice, first in German, then in English, while all other scenes would be recycled between the two. And with that, it was time to cast. For the role of Count Orlok, now Count Dracula, Herzog had only one name in mind, Klaus Kinski. He was Herzog's first, last, and only choice. He knew of no one else who could do it. Herzog's regular crew, of course, were horrified by this. Why would he subject them to that madman again? What had they done to deserve that? Had they not been loyal enough to him in the past? Since they were that loyal, though, they relented. Herzog was right, of course. No one would be able to deliver a performance like Kinski, for he was indeed the last expressionist actor. But where Max Schreck's original Count Orlok was a rat-like soulless creature, Kinski's Count Dracula is more human, and his sadness over not being able to participate in human society is at the centerpiece of Herzog's film. He is not that vulnerable though, and absolutely has predatory tendencies, like a spider going after the fly caught in its web. And with that visual idea planted, note how Kinski's hands will emote a spider. For the rest of the cast, Herzog went with authenticity, as he wanted faces that didn't belong in the 20th century, but that fit with each other. And, let's not deny it, that would attract an international audience, to say nothing of funding from international production partners, like French production company Gaumont. For the role of Ellen Hutter then, now Lucy Harker instead of Mina Harker for some reason, Herzog went with French actress Isabelle Adjani, who was already a star at this point. She was, however, the polar opposite to Kinski in terms of personality, constantly needing assurance that she delivered the performance the director wanted, which led to some very interesting interplay between her and Kinski. For the role of Thomas Hutter, here Jonathan Harker, Herzog went with theater actor Bruno Ganz, who was still mostly unknown to the public at large, even if he had just co-starred with Dennis Hopper in The American Friend. Today, you all know him though, you just don't know it. In 2004, he portrayed a certain leader in the movie Der Untergang, known as Downfall in the English-language world, from which one clip has gone viral in many variations on many occasions.
Es bleiben im Raum Keitel, Jodl, Krebs und Burgdorf.
Das war ein Befehl! Der Angriff Steiners war ein Befehl! Wer schickt Sie? So weit ist das also gekommen. Jeder hat mich belogen, sogar die SS! Die gesamte Generalität des Militärs hat mich belogen! Das dreistige Treue! Verräter, Versager!
Mein Führer, was Sie da sagen, ist ungeheuerlich!
Here, it is also worth noting that alongside Klaus Kinski, Bruno Ganz is the only other principal actor who performs his own dialogue in both the English and German versions of the movie. Everyone else is overdubbed in at least one of the versions, and often both. While both the English and German versions of the movie are near identical, connoisseurs should go with the German version, as the scenes where Ganz and Kinski act together in their native language are subtly elevated over the ones where they also have to focus on enunciating in English, a language both were proficient in, but not so much that it didn't require significant attention on their part. The original Nosferatu was set in the fictional German city of Wisborg, as is the Eggers version. Herzog's remake, by contrast, was set in the very real German city of Wismar, where the original movie partially had been filmed. Herzog wasn't able to film in Wismar though, so instead, the bulk of the city scenes were filmed in Delft in the Netherlands, apart from the plague scenes that is, which were shot in the nearby Schiedam, as the local authorities in Delft didn't approve of bringing in the 11,000 rats required for those scenes, even if, reportedly, not a single one of them escaped. The movie was incidentally criticized for how the rats were handled, because they were all white lab rats, dyed grey for the occasion, and since there were 11,000 of them, speed was prioritized over the comfort of the rats, let's say. Also, for Dracula's estate in Wismar, they returned to Lübeck and the exact same location as was used in the original movie. You can see how the vegetation has grown in the intervening years. According to Herzog, Kinski was even filmed looking out the exact same window as Max Schreck did all those years earlier. Herzog wanted to film the Dracula scenes in Transylvania, or rather the modern-day version Romania, but wasn't able to obtain the necessary permits, so instead, the Slovakian countryside stood in for the Romanian, though with actual Romani gypsies as extras. The introspective journey to Dracula's castle was filmed in Bavaria, Germany, close to Herzog's childhood home, and Pernstein Castle in Czechoslovakia was used as Dracula's castle. Every last bit of furniture in the castle, however, was custom-made for the movie. In order to set the tone in the beginning of the movie though, Herzog returned to the Mexican town Guanajuato, where he had spent some time in the 60s to film the actual mummies there.
You should not count the difficulties. You should not count the money. You should not count the extras. What counts is what you see from the screen, nothing else. All my films, maybe if you have seen any, come out from pain. That's the source. That's where they come from, not from pleasure.
Since Herzog knew how to deal with Kinski's attention-seeking fits of rage, including how to set him off and burn him out for an hour before filming mellower scenes, production went on mostly without a hitch, with Herzog also using his regular tricks to get even the extras to perform completely naturally.
You will see I will give the signal immediately, because we shoot secretly, and they do not know that we do it. So we are very calm, very quiet, and I give a secret signal to one man on the boat, and then they start to work.
Why do you want to make it this way?
Because extras always look like extras, but this way they look like people who work.
Even if the movie was intended for a wider audience than some of his previous films, Herzog still got some of his directorial trademarks in there as well, like characters being shown from behind and at a distance in emotional scenes, a marked contrast from Hollywood cinema. He also had a native child playing an instrument, and of course his fascination with the Middle Age greatly elevated the plague scenes, and especially the celebration of the survivors. Interestingly, the movie features no end credits, as Herzog's intention was that the story continues, but in the heart and mind of the viewer, riding into the storm that is coming. "1979 saw the release of 3 major vampire movies. In addition to Herzog's Nosferatu, there was also Universal's own Dracula reboot starring Frank Langella and the comedy Love at First Bite, and of the 3, Nosferatu was the least commercially successful. But as we saw earlier, Herzog's intention wasn't to release the #1 vampire movie of the year, but to re-legitimize German cinema and to bridge the gap between the expressionism of the past with the contemporary Renaissance, and in this, Nosferatu was widely recognized as having been successful. German cinema was respected and recognized once again, in no small part because of Werner Herzog and his Nosferatu. Beyond that, the movie was successful relative to its budget, and it has gone on to receive more and more acclaim with later re-releases. New generations keep on rediscovering it, most recently in conjunction with Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, which itself took some level of inspiration from the Herzog version. To list some examples of this influence, there is of course the vampire's labored wheezing. There is the attempt at sanctifying Nosferatu's lair so he couldn't return to rest in his native soil, but perhaps more importantly, the maiden distracting the vampire by offering him more blood when he momentarily remembers the time, and of course how looking at the sun blinds him before it kills him. While Herzog's Nosferatu may have been the least successful of the 3 major vampire movies released in 1979, it has stood the test of time in a way that none of the others did, and even at the time, it elevated the careers of everyone involved with it. The role was a demanding one for Klaus Kinski, as it required 4 hours of makeup every day. Werner Herzog knew to take advantage of his exhaustion though, so just 5 days after production ended on Nosferatu, the two made their 3rd movie together, Wojciech, where Kinski's exhaustion is central to the performance. Also of note, in one of his final roles, Klaus Kinski would reprise his role as Nosferatu in the 1988 Nosferatu in Venice, a movie which has no connection to Herzog's Nosferatu whatsoever, but it paid well, so Kinski took it on. Yet it is for his work with Werner Herzog, including with Herzog's Nosferatu, that he will forever be remembered.
But I really want to kill him.
Yes. He also did want to kill me.
Let me know your thoughts on Herzog, Kinski, Adjani, the different versions of Nosferatu, and while you're at it, the fearless vampire killers, in the comments.